WOCA. Ocala.
All right, 5 minutes after 9 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in this Wednesday morning. Gosh, you're going to just love this next book. It just reveals so much about who we are, who we were as Americans, and how far we've come, and how far we still need to go. And so many different things that this book brought to mind. What a well-written book we're about to introduce you to. One of the authors of the book is on the phone. His name is Adar Cohen. He is a teacher, an organizer. He's a researcher in the areas of conflict resolution, youth empowerment, nonviolent social change. He's the founding director of programs for the Civic Leadership Foundation. He teaches peace, justice, and conflict studies at DePaul University in Chicago. And the book that he wrote with Steve Pfeffer, I might be saying Steve's name wrong, is Jimmie Lee and James, Two Lives, Two Deaths, and the Movement That Changed America. You might remember this if you're old enough. March 7th, 1965. Does Selma and Montgomery, Alabama ring a bell? That's probably the best way, because sometimes dates don't ring a bell. You name those two cities and you suddenly know what we're talking about, especially if you say 1965. Well, this is part of that story that we've never heard before, so we're going to hear it right now. Adar Cohen. Good morning, Adar.
Good morning, Larry. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Where are you? Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Chicago.
So, gosh, there's so many questions. I don't know where to start, but I guess the one I want to know, and that maybe this is more appropriate for later, but here I go. How did you get involved in this particular story? Is there a story behind your story?
There is. I've been involved for over a decade in advancing the study and the application of nonviolent methods for social change and for political change. And so my interest in the civil rights period, as you can imagine, has only grown as I've both studied the impact and effectiveness it had back then and witnessed how contemporary applications of some of those ideas have been so much more successful than other methods today. And the other side of the story is that Steve Pfeffer is actually my father-in-law.
Oh, okay.
And also a close friend and collaborator, and we've long looked for the opportunity to work together on a book, and this one really captured some of our areas of interest nicely.
So the book focuses on James Reeb and tell me the other name again.
Yeah, Jimmie Lee Jackson is the other activist who we look at, and those are two lesser-known figures in this historic period. We've heard a lot about some of the other activists of the day, and our feeling was that Jimmie Lee Jackson and James Reeb, whose contributions to the movement were monumental, are not celebrated enough. And their stories actually told together paint a vivid picture of that period leading up to the Voting Rights Act in 1965.
So, who are they? I know that James Reeb is a reverend, was a reverend. Tell us tell us a little bit about them, and then we'll dig deeper.
I'd be happy to. Jimmie Lee Jackson is a African American woodchopper and farmer, a deacon in his church in Marion, Alabama, and attempts to register himself to vote half a dozen times. Begins participating in demonstrations, nonviolent, peaceful demonstrations, to achieve that right. And on an evening during a night march, police and posse men and just local ruffians who had been deputized by the police, they cut out the city lights and just rained a brutal attack on nonviolent demonstrators, and in that melee, Jimmie Lee Jackson was shot and died of that injury.
Wow, and that was in Selma?
That was in Marion, Alabama.
Oh, in Marion.
Near, not far from Selma, which was also a hotbed of activism at the time, and a place where dramatic protests were being staged to demonstrate the grievances with voting rights disenfranchisement.
Okay, so he's
James Reeb. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Before you talk about James Reeb, I want to ask you something. So it's not legal at that time for a black man to vote. Is that right?
Well, that's such a good question. It is. It is
That's
the law
what I was
that a
confused
black man
about.
should vote. What activists were pushing for, just like the Freedom Riders were pushing for proper enforcement of that law. So the Civil Rights Act and it was already law that African Americans could vote. But in the South and elsewhere, voting registrars would put up unbelievable hurdles to voting with these bizarre, ridiculous literacy tests and questions like, how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap? Anything to disqualify.
Oh, is that really one of the questions?
That's really one of the questions. How many jelly beans in this jar?
Oh, wow.
Things that not only disenfranchised from the right to vote, but actually made a mockery of the attempt to try to vote. But in addition to those barriers at the registrar, there was a very real system of threat and intimidation throughout the South that enforced Jim Crow and kept blacks out of the voting boxes, and that had to do with being run off of your job, nighttime phone calls, harassment, beatings, lynchings. We know the story. That cocktail was just as potent as the barriers at the voting registrar in preventing blacks from voting.
Well, when James Reeb was protesting with other people, were they marching anywhere, or were they standing in front of the voting registration place, or what were they doing? Where were they?
They were. Well, I'll just back up to answer that question and tell you that in the wake of Jimmie Lee Jackson's death, the movement doubles down its efforts and says this cannot happen in vain. We need the right to vote. And Dr. King eulogizes Jimmie Lee Jackson at Zion United, his church there in Marion, and the movement looks to march from Selma to Montgomery, and that's where we have the historic brutality on the Edmund Pettus Bridge that we call Bloody Sunday now. In the wake of Bloody Sunday, Dr. King calls on clergy from all over the country, particularly white clergy, to come and bear witness to this in Selma. And that's when Reverend Reeb, James Reeb, responds to that call and leaves his work as a fair housing organizer in Boston and comes to Selma. And just shortly after that, he's attacked on his way from dinner back to Brown Chapel Church, where they would await further instruction from King. So it actually was not on a march or during a vigil or during a demonstration at all. Okay. He was just making his way from dinner back to the church and was set upon by some local segregationists.
So he answers the call from Martin Luther King Jr. He comes down from Boston, and does he die in that attack?
He does. He dies from those injuries. Mm-hmm.
Wow, what it must have been like to be both black and a white supporter of black rights at that time. I mean, it must have been.
Well, it was a really, as you know, a tumultuous period. And one of the things that we've found out in all of the research that we've conducted for this book, which took us more than 2 years, was that in some ways the struggle itself, those meetings, those workshops in the church basements, those freedom rallies in the worship area of the church, those were precious moments where suddenly, and in some cases for the first time, whites and blacks who were committed to this cause were working hand in hand, were walking side by side, and there was a social transformation that seemed to take place within the movement that was something that sustained the movement. So in other words, they had created an example for the rest of the country. And in some ways we chose to tell the story of Reeb and Jackson because one is black and one is white. Sadly, they never knew each other. They never had the chance to meet. But their lives were intertwined in their commitment to this cause.
I mean, we have... I guess we got to go up against a break right now, but when we come back, we'll talk about this. I mean, in the world right now, everything is not good. In the United States, it's getting better, and you could argue it's a lot better, but it's not perfect. I mean, look at the news, and This is an important story even today. How many years has it been since 65? 50 years?
Yeah.
50 years.
Right.
All right, we'll take a little break and we'll be right back. If you're just tuning in, our guest is Adar Cohen. His co-author is his father-in-law, we found out, Steve, and it's pronounced Pfeiffer. I was saying it wrong. I always, when there's two choices, I always get it wrong. All right, Adar, what a great interview so far. We'll take a little break and be right back and continue our discussion. The book, again, is called Jimmie Lee and James, Two Lives, Two Deaths, and the Movement That Changed America. We're talking about Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965, in Alabama, the Selma, Montgomery area. We'll be right back.
The weather is brought to you by myfwc.com. Safe boating is no accident for today. Intervals of cloud and sunshine. There'll be a shower and thunderstorm or two around, the high 79 to 83. Partly to mostly cloudy skies tonight, the low 60 well inland, but about 66 along the coast. Rather breezy at the coast as well. For tomorrow, partly sunny skies, the high 83 at the coast to 89 inland. For Friday, partly sunny with a chance for a shower, high 87 to 91. From the Florida Weather Center, I'm meteorologist Joe Lundberg.
Are you tired of not using your home's outdoor space for entertaining or relaxation because of all the bugs and leaves? Consider adding a beautiful screen room or glass enclosure. We are Superior Aluminum and Design, a family-owned and operated business with 20 years experience in the aluminum industry, and we are accredited by the Better Business Bureau. If you appreciate superior workmanship, call Superior Aluminum and Design at 817-8058 or visit us on the web at superiораluminumdesign.com.
Good credits, bad credits. It's none of our business because we're not an auto dealer. We're not a bank. We're not your mother. We're OcalaForSale.com. Marion County's marketplace for cars, trucks, and SUVs. We've got thousands of sellers standing by to take your call. No middleman. But hurry, don't walk, don't run. Just sit down and log on to OcalaForSale.com. Prices and inventory change daily. Offer does not include dealer upcharge. Undercutting, rust-proofing, factory surcharge, or delivery fee. See website for details.
Do you have areas that have started sagging or drooping? Is what you're looking at not quite the same as it was years ago? Are there enhancements you've been putting off? Is there serious damage you need fixed? Then call on us, Damage Control Services, when your roof is sagging and the drywall is drooping after a storm, or your home just needs some enhancements. From damage repairs to new construction, Damage Control Services is here to help.
Hi, I'm Leah Caruso with Strive Rehabilitation, inviting you to join me Thursday at 11 a.m. for Health Matters. Ocala Health and Strive have teamed up to bring you the latest information on good health services available to you right here at home. This vital information will help you make informed decisions about your health. So don't forget to join me here at 11 a.m. Thursday. It's news you can use from Ocala Health, Strive, and your friends here at WOCA.
All right, 18 minutes after 9 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. Adar Cohen is on the phone. He's a teacher. He is a really brilliant guy. I'll just sum it up that way. He wrote a book called Jimmie Lee and James with his father-in-law, right? Did I say that right? Steve Pfeiffer. Mm-hmm. And we're talking about Jimmie Lee Jackson and Reverend James Reeb, who were both killed in attacks as Mr. Jackson was trying to exercise his right to vote, which was being denied because of silly little questions that he had to answer, like how many jelly beans in a jar, how many bubbles in a bar of soap.
Exactly.
Unbelievable.
It's so crazy.
All right, so Adar, I wanted to ask you something about this because what I was caught off guard by was the fact that this was continuing even in recent years. The trials, is that right?
That's right. The district attorney, Michael Jackson, no relation to Jimmie Lee Jackson, reopened a case against State Trooper James Bernard Fowler 40 years after he shot and killed Jimmie Lee Jackson. And this was really a moment of reckoning for the community in Marion, which had long felt that a silence hovered over Jimmie Lee Jackson's death, and that yet another white law enforcement official had taken the life of a peaceful black protester. And we chronicle the effort to bring James Bernard Fowler to justice, and interviewed the district attorney and accessed FBI files that gave us a pretty close look at that whole process. You know, and it really calls into question the relevance of our book today. We really my hope for the book is that it can speak to some of the challenges we face across the country today in relation to patterns of unconstitutional and violent policing, and also in terms of the ongoing challenge of empowering and enfranchising voters of all backgrounds, especially minorities.
And Jimmie Lee Jackson was trying to help his mom?
Well, that's what happened. I mean, there was a very violent attack on the peaceful protesters there in Marion who were attempting to conduct a vigil outside of their church. The police cut the downtown city lights, plunging the streets in darkness, and what followed was a really horrific scene of brutality. And the news media were not spared. They were beaten severely, and their cameras were sprayed with black spray paint to prevent capturing any of these images. Jimmie Lee Jackson's mother and grandfather had sought to flee the violence, but had been engulfed in a melee in the local cafe there. When Jimmie Lee Jackson came in to find them, he saw his mother engaged in a struggle with a police officer.
So the trooper, Fowler, he pleaded guilty, but it was like a really small charge?
It was, in the end, what many in the community viewed as a watered-down charge. He was an aging man in poor health. It was 40 years later. The negotiation on the sentencing really became a very human process, and I think in some ways didn't satisfy anyone. Which any negotiation can often mean that it was a good compromise. So there was a symbolic sentence. I think he was sentenced to 6 months and served something a little bit less than that. But it really, I think, has to do with the symbolic value of justice being served after so long.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah.
So what about the person responsible for the death of Reverend Reeb?
They were all found not guilty, and kind of faded into the background. This was, a time where outside agitators were kind of thought to be open season on activists who came from out of town. It was considered a real violation of the Southern etiquette to come from outside and impose your own values and say you know what's best for a community.
Do you know, it is so hard to understand the mindset of somebody who says they believe in the values of America and believes in the value of people having the right to choose who represents us in Washington, D.C. It's beyond belief that we will say we are the people of the people and all that, and then not allow certain people to have a say-so. And if there's any disenfranchising that happens today, it's the same thing if it's indeed happening. The one thing that is ironic, and I'd like you to comment on it, is the fact that whenever there's peaceful protests, whether it's Mahatma Gandhi who gets killed or Martin Luther King Jr. who gets killed, it is that assassination that somehow elevates everything they were trying to do to a point that is greater than they probably could have achieved as alive, which is sad. But it puts something behind it. Even Lincoln's assassination elevated his beliefs. You know, it is interesting and sad. It's a weird thing about us as human beings.
Yeah, well, there's a trade-off made. I think Dr. King's. We can use Dr. King as an example. His legacy. It towers over us. It's before us so often. He's invoked publicly, his powerful words, his oratory. And I agree with you. I think that his status and his legacy and his actions were heightened by his tragic assassination. And yet the trade-off we make is what could he have contributed in those years
Exactly.
that were stolen from him, and maybe his ongoing work on behalf of African Americans and later in his career on behalf of poor folks generally. What would that have contributed? We could have done without a few years of his legacy, and taken more of his contribution.
Well, and in Nelson Mandela's case, even similar in that he wasn't assassinated, but he was jailed, and in a way that elevated his.
In some ways, the nonviolent, the strategy, and the.
Hey there, Adar. Adar, we don't hear you. If you hear us. Don't you hate when that happens?
Yeah, I do. The light's still on. But...
The light's still on. Adar, I don't know if you hear us or not, but we're not hearing you.
Oh,
yeah.
there he is.
Can you hear me now?
Now I hear you. Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. I was just sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened, but I was just about to point out that a nonviolent campaign banks on these very dramatic moments, and though of course you never plan for, you never calculate to have a martyr. But part of the strategy does account for, when we put our lives on the line, nonviolently, and when we refuse to retaliate, we need to know that violence against us will become part of the scenario. We need to stay nonviolent and count on the fact that the public will witness this injustice, and that it will show the fangs of the deeper injustice that lurks beneath.
And isn't it interesting that you and your father-in-law were both part of this? Because I wouldn't know about this story if it wasn't for you, and I'm guessing I'm not alone. And this is just another piece of information that I will benefit from knowing, and it'll give me something more to bring up whenever this subject comes up.
I'm glad to hear that.
And earlier you were speaking about outsiders, and violence escalates because of them. And I feel that's what happened in Baltimore. Nothing could be contained because the outsiders came in and started looting and rioting, and that just escalated and had to bring in more law enforcement.
Yeah, well, that's right. I think that an important distinction needs to be made between nonviolent outside agitators and outside agitators who wish to foment chaos and more violence. Because James Reeb and so many other activists during the civil rights era, they were outside agitators. And one activist famously, when being accused of being an outside agitator, which was really a kind of a denigrating designation at the time, said, the agitator is the part of the washing machine that gets the clothes clean. And I think but I think you make a really important point. We should look to the legacy of these nonviolent heroes from the civil rights era who were so disciplined and committed to a nonviolent strategy. I think there's so much value to that we could make use of today.
And it's very interesting that each of the men were named James.
It is also very interesting. I agree. Yeah.
All right, I have a copy of the book. It is just a wonderful, well-written book, and it'll make you think. It'll make you realize where we've been, how far we've come, how far we still need to go. It is not just about 50 years ago. It's about today. Jimmie Lee and James is the title of the book. Adar, Cohen, and Steve Pfeiffer are the authors. Call me if you want the copy that was sent to us. The rest of us will have to go buy it, including Robin and I. Do you have a website, Adar?
We don't, but you can look up the book at Regan Arts.
How do you spell that? R-E-G?
R-E-G-A-N Arts. That's right. That's our publisher.
And is it on Amazon and all the others as well?
It's on all those places. Yep, you can find it in Amazon and your local bookstore and large national bookstores.
Okay, let me give this one away. Good morning. You've got the book. Who's this?
Yeah, this is Jim.
Jim, you got it. It'll be waiting for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do you know, in 40 seconds, if I could tell you this real quickly, Robin and I are songwriters, and we have a song that looks to the future and the children who can't understand all of the history because they can't imagine people being so mean to each other. And we're traveling to the future in this song, and we say, we seemed primitive, but how can we blame them? We fought in wars declared by insane men. We called a black man and not just a man. One day. Thank you, Adar. Thank you for being on the air with us today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking with you both.
All right, we'll be right back.
Fox News Radio, I'm Pat O'Neill. French officials now believe the co-pilot who crashed a plane into the Alps in March practiced the fatal descent several times on the plane's prior flight.
Each time he then